I can't stress enough the need for proper requirements gathering and how you should have a team of analysts working on gathering requirements. You know, in all honesty, in larger organizations, analysts should actually learn at least this much coding so they understand what it is that application developers really need, so that they understand how to write a use case. They understand what black and white, clear requirements the application developer needs. And an application developer, even though they tend to not really have maybe the personality for it, they should learn to interact a little bit, or at least understand how the business analyst works and how they have to work with a customer who has only the vaguest notions of, oh, we'd kind of like this, and they don't even have the first clue if that's really what they want. So when you're gathering requirements, you got to make sure that you're not interested in having them say, well, we want a kiosk to that we can walk in and use in the lobby. Instead, what are they trying to solve? You're less interested in hearing their solution, although you do want to hear the solution because they may have figured it out. But generally, the customers, the clients, and usually they're within your own company, they're just another department or unit, generally they're trying to solve a problem. And the problem could simply be, well, we just simply need to be able to move the lines of customers past our desk faster. You know, when people come in to apply for a loan or something, maybe we need something that helps automate that process. And they might come up with solutions already, but what you're really trying to hear is, okay, you get a backlog of customers who are trying to go through an application process, you need something to help that. So maybe a very simple self-service thing. All right, well, when they go through the application process, what are the bottlenecks? And so you really need to talk to them. Oh, the bottleneck is just the pre-approval of whether or not they even qualify for this loan or something. And so then you go, okay, well, let's see if that's really the pre-approval process is really the bottleneck here, then can we develop something that helps the customers go through a pre-approval? And if they're not pre-approved, then we divert them to some other sort of customer service. And meanwhile, you know, who's alerted to this? And then different people will say, well, you know, I don't want to lose track of these folks. I want to offer them other services. If they're not approved automatically for this kind of loan, we can still offer them those kinds of things. And then somebody else will say, well, I want to make sure that when they walk in, there's not a huge crowd of people milling around waiting, because they'll get bored and they'll run across the street to the competitor. So you want to hear people's pain points when you're gathering requirements, and rather than their immediate solution, because the immediate solution may not really be what it is that they need. They may be thinking that they want a kiosk or a program or a website or something, but that may not really address what they need. And then, of course, upper management is going to have, or management or whoever the sponsor is going to have the final say, and they're going to say, yeah, we do need this, but all of those little wish list want to have features we can't afford, or that's beyond the scope of this, and finally the management will decide what really goes into this project. So when you're gathering requirements, you need to know how the end user is going to interact with this system, because they're the ones who are going to implement it, and they're the ones who are going to adapt to it or need to. So how will they interact with this thing? What are the conditions that this thing will operate in? Like, you know, when I was in Africa, we had a situation where we had to get these little computer systems out in the bush, and like some of these sites are off the electric grid, right? And how do you get a computer system to a health facility that doesn't have power? Well, now we're looking at solar power, and we're looking at solar panels that are just like on a rubber sort of backing, so that you can put coffee cups on them. So we understood the environment. It was harsh. People will be untrained to deal with those kinds of technologies. There will be loads of dust. People will put things on stuff, and it has to be low power consuming. The panel, the solar panel, it's just a rubber thing that opens up, has to directly feed the little netbook that we're going to give them. So I mean, you need to understand the environment itself. Or understand that maybe in that location there's no internet access, or in that particular location When you roll out computers, don't put a virtual machine on it because they have enough trouble understanding a desktop. Don't give them two start menus. So you need to understand the environment in which users will use it and how they'll interact with it. And one of the things is that developers who are so busy creating a solution and who are so very, very savvy in just the latest stuff, they may not comprehend the user's environment or the user's situation, and the system analyst has to explain that. We used to, in Africa, take developers with us out into the field so they could see for themselves the level of the user. Users can't even find the space bar, so don't give them, a virtual machine kind of thing. So you really need to understand this, and I can't stress it enough. Success of a project will depend upon how well we gather requirements and translate requirements into a solid design that then the developers can really understand and sink their teeth into. So we need to understand, of course, the conditions, how the users will interact, and any criteria that the system is going to need to meet. So when we're looking at the requirements definition process, here's a good little checklist here. Identify the stakeholders. Stakeholders are not just management. They also include all the people who are going to use this thing. Analyze the requirements to locate and fix any conflicts. Identify the boundaries of the system, and ideally, how will this thing interact with the whole environment. Convert user requirements into actual system requirements. Record the requirements in a formalized structure. And so like for developers, often you'll write use cases for them. You'll probably write use cases for them. And then verify that the requirements are totally complete, they're verifiable, you can change them, you can test them, they're consistent. If there are any conflicts between stakeholders, which there will be, because people will have all kinds of wish lists and they'll want all kinds of features that aren't realistic. And then resolve the conflicts. Usually upper management or the project sponsor says, no, folks, this will ultimately be what we have. And then it's up to management to work with people to help adapt to this new solution, whatever it is. When we are looking at requirements, when we are analyzing the requirements and managing the requirements, we need to make sure that this requirement, we need to understand what are the constraints of this organization. Like, I've been in situations where the organization had all the money in the world and then where they had no money. And so what are the constraints? And organization, they had all the money and huge amounts of technical expertise and highly technical consultants that they could pull in, as opposed to no money whatsoever. They were surviving on donor funds, and everybody was overworked because hardly anybody had any training. So you need to understand what are the constraints of the organization. And what will the functionality be of this thing? What performance levels are required? So like in our case in Africa, well, they only need to fire this thing up for a couple of hours for data entry. And it doesn't need to be on 99.999% of the time. It needs to survive in a harsh environment, as opposed to being up and fast. It just needs to be able to come on, they can do their data entry from paper, and then they can shut it off. And it needs to survive heat and dust and moisture and rains and all kinds of that sort of thing. And then also, what external system does it have to be compatible with? I mean, I've seen so many solutions that when you try to plug them into the larger picture, they're either duplicating work, they're a parallel system. Now you've added burden to people because now they've got two data entry systems, and then you have to somehow put the data together, and there's no mechanism for that. So how compatible are these solutions? And we obtain all this information by interviewing everybody. The customer, we have the use cases, we have the wish lists, we talk to everybody, including the folks who possibly could develop it. One thing that you'll do if you get an outside contractor is you'll send out a request for proposal, an RFP. And in an RFP, you're asking vendors or whatever organization is creating this thing, would you please propose your solution, your product? If you send out RFPs, be sure to make sure that the RFP is not just the solution, but it includes things like the financial stability of the vendor, how available will they be to support the product, and not only during the installation, but afterwards, how much you can interact with them during the development phase, so that you can make sure that they're staying on track. Will the source code be available? What if that vendor goes out of business? I mean, I've certainly been in situations where even before the product was done, they went out of business. We need to have the source code in escrow so we can go grab it as part of our contract. We can have the source code and get someone else to finish it up. Or also, what is their contingency plan? What's the vendor's contingency plan if they can't meet your needs? I've been in situations where we had customers who were completely didn't know what they wanted. They kept adding requirements as we went along, and we had to have a contingency plan for bringing in extra personnel and extra staff, and we had to have in the contract stating that if you change the scope, Mr. Customer, we have to be able to renegotiate the price, because now we've got to bring people in because you've got a deadline, and because you couldn't estimate your deadline and you changed the scope after we signed the deal. If you need more out of us than was all planned for, because you changed scope, we've got to charge this back to you. So you've got to make sure that all of this is in the RFP so that everything is covered and everything is clearly understood. One of the big killers of projects is that people assume that things will be understood, or there will be no issues or no conflicts as we get into it. Don't assume for anything. Have the contingencies written down in black and white. What do we expect, and what happens in case things go awry? And make sure everybody understands up front. So for determining the business case for this thing, this system, this solution, this application, as we are auditing this, let's take a look. When they created the business case for this, whatever this is, this change, was this logged officially? I mean, was this really actually logged? Was there a feasibility study? Was there an actual business case made? Were the benefits clearly defined, and were the requirements clearly gathered and stated? Were they all collected in an accurate and measurable and useful way? If there were any RFPs, what were the RFPs? And were there RFPs from many suppliers so that we can compare them? Because, of course, one thing you don't want is somebody keep on giving the contract to a brother-in-law. Not that that's necessarily bad, but you want to make sure that enough vendors have proposed their own solution so that there was choice, and that a choice was made in a fair and equitable way that made business sense. So the IS auditor needs to be looking at all of these things, at the requirements and early parts of a system or software development lifecycle.